The cold was a knife, and it was 6 inches deep in her lungs. It was the winter of 1883, and the Wyoming Territory was trying to kill her. The wind coming off the Wind River Range had teeth, and it was chewing what little was left of Clara. She crouched behind a granite boulder, her breath pluming in front of her face, instantly snatched away by the wind. She was gaunt, a thing of sharp angles and hollows, her skin smeared with the dirt of 3 weeks of running. Her coat, thin and meant for a civilized autumn, was in tatters. She had been a widow for 2 months. She had been starving for 3 weeks. She was, by her own count, 26 years old, though she felt closer to 100. Below her, in a small clearing protected by a stand of lodgepole pine, was the camp. It was not much, a lean-to, a frozen creek, and a horse. The horse was what mattered. It was a solid-looking Mustang, bay-colored, thick with a winter coat. It stood tethered to a high line, tail to the wind, patient. It was life. It was the only way south before the next storm buried the passes for good. She had watched the man leave an hour ago, just as the weak sun began to touch the peaks. He was a mountain man, built like the granite she hid behind, wrapped in a buffalo hide coat that made him seem twice as wide. He had a long rifle resting in the crook of his arm and snowshoes strapped to his feet. He had disappeared into the timber, moving silent as smoke. He was hunting. That gave her time. Clara pushed herself up. Her legs screamed. The frostbite in her toes had long since turned to a dull, wooden ache. She moved from the rock, stumbling down the incline, her broken boots punching through the crust of snow. The horse lifted its head, ears swiveling. It snorted, a cloud of white, watching her. "Easy," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you." She kept her hands low, moving slow. Her mind was racing. She just needed to get the tether undone. She didn't have a saddle, but it didn't matter. She would ride this horse until it dropped. Then she would walk. She had to get to her aunt's place in Colorado. It was the only place left. She reached the high line. Her fingers, stiff and cracked, fumbled with the frozen knot. They were useless claws. She pulled off her thin glove with her teeth and worked at the rope with bare skin. The frost on the hemp seared her flesh. The horse watched her, curious but not afraid. It was used to the man. "Please," she begged the knot. "Please." She was weeping, but the tears froze on her cheeks, tight and stinging. This was her last chance. She had walked for weeks after fleeing her brother-in-law, living on roots she'd dug up and one rabbit she'd managed to trap. But the snows had come hard, and now there was nothing, only the cold and the horse. The knot finally gave. She grabbed the rope, her hand burning. She tugged the horse's head down. "Come on, we're leaving." "That's not your horse." The voice was low, rough as scraped rock. It came from directly behind her. Clara stopped breathing. Every memory of violence, every raised hand and angry shout she had ever known, crashed down on her. She did not turn. She simply let go of the rope and squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the blow. She had been caught. This was the end. The blow didn't come. There was only the sound of the wind in the pines and the heavy crunch of snowshoes approaching. Slowly, she forced herself to turn. He was a wall. He stood a full head taller than any man she had ever seen, broad and solid. His face was lost in a thick, dark beard frosted with ice. His eyes, deep set under a heavy brow, were the color of a winter sky. He wore the buffalo hide coat, and it hung on him like armor. The long rifle was still in his arm, pointed at the snow. He was not angry. He looked tired and suspicious. "What do you think you're doing?" He said. It was not a question. Clara tried to speak, but only a dry click came out. She backed away, stumbling, and fell into the snow. She crab-walked backward, pushing herself away, her eyes wide with terror. "Please, I was just..." I need—" He watched her scramble, his expression unchanged. He looked at her thin clothes, her gaunt face, the way her whole body shook. He looked at the sky, sniffing the air. "You'll be dead in 2 hours," he said. "Storm's turning." "I have to go south," she whispered, the words desperate. "I have to get south." "You'll get south," he rumbled. "You'll be buried in it. You take that horse, you won't make it past the ridge before the wind tears you apart. He'll throw you, and you'll freeze." He took a step. Clara flinched and threw her hands up to cover her face. Elias stopped. He stood there for a long moment, watching the woman tremble in the snow. She was half-starved, dressed in rags, and terrified to the point of sickness. He had seen fear before, plenty of it, but this was different. This was old fear. It was dug in deep. He lowered his rifle. Leaning it against a tree, he was annoyed. He had come back for a better axe, and found this a complication. "I'm not going to hit you," he said, his voice flat. Clara slowly, cautiously, lowered her arms. She stared at him, unbelieving. "You want the horse," he stated. She nodded, her chin trembling so hard she could barely control it. He grunted. He looked at the horse, then back at her. He saw the fading yellow-green of a bruise high on her cheekbone, peeking from her tangled hair. He saw the cracked blue of her lips. He could not, in good conscience, let her walk to her death. It was impractical. It would be a waste. "All right," he said. Her eyes widened. "You can have the horse." She stared, uncomprehending. "But not now," he continued, cutting off her hope. "You'll die. I won't have that on my hands." He pointed up toward the timberline, where the trees grew thick. "You stay with me. You stay till the spring thaw. When the pass is clear, you can take him. You can ride south." Clara's mind stalled. Stay? With him? A strange man? Alone? In the mountains? It was a trap. It had to be. Her late husband, Amos, had been full of traps. Promises that turned into fists. Kindness that turned into demands. "Why?" she whispered, her voice full of suspicion. "Because," Elias said, annoyed. "I don't want to find your frozen body come spring. You're too weak to travel, and that storm will last 3 days, maybe 4. He was right. She knew he was. She could feel the pressure dropping, the air growing heavy and still. The air always went still right before a blizzard tried to end the world. But staying... She looked at him. He was huge and rough, and he lived alone, but he hadn't hit her. He hadn't even yelled. He had caught her stealing his only way out of these mountains, and he was offering shelter? What do you want?" she asked, the question costing her everything. Elias looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something flicker in his eyes. It looked like disgust, but it wasn't aimed at her. "I want you to not die," he said. "That's all. You stay, you eat, you stay warm. When the thaw comes, you take the horse and you leave. That's the trade." He was offering her life, a different kind of life than the horse offered, a slower one. But it was still a chance. Desperate, exhausted, she weighed her options: freeze to death alone in the snow, or take a chance on a man who hadn't hurt her. Yet, she gave a single jerky nod. "All right, get up," he said. He didn't offer a hand. He just turned his back on her, picked up his rifle, and started walking toward the timber. "Cabin's this way. Keep up." Clara stared at his retreating back. He had just turned his back on her. He wasn't dragging her. He wasn't gripping her arm. He was just walking. She pushed herself to her feet, her body screaming in protest. She glanced one last time at the horse, then she hurried after the mountain man, stumbling to keep his long-legged, snowshoe pace. The cabin was dug into a hillside, barely visible until they were almost on it. It was made of thick, dark logs, chinked with mud and moss. The roof was heavy with sod and a thick blanket of snow. A thin ribbon of smoke curled from a stone chimney. It was a den, a burrow. Elias pushed the heavy door open, and a wave of dense warmth hit her. It smelled of pine smoke, cured meat, and something else, old solitude. He stepped inside and gestured, "In." Clara hesitated on the threshold, her eyes struggling to adjust to the dimness. "Get in," he repeated, not unkindly. "You're letting the heat out." She scurried past him, careful not to brush against him. The inside was one room. Her stomach knotted. One room. A stone hearth dominated the far wall, a black pot hanging from a hook over a low fire. A narrow cot, piled with furs, sat in one corner. Shelves built into the wall held tins, jars, and neatly folded traps. Pelts were stacked in another corner. A rough-hewn table with one stool stood in the center. It was tight. The walls felt close. Elias shut the door, and the sound was a heavy, final thud. He slid a thick wooden bar into place. Clara retreated to the furthest corner, the one near the stacked pelts. She wrapped her arms around herself, watching him. He paid her no mind. He moved with a quiet, efficient grace that was unnerving in a man his size. He took off the buffalo coat, hanging it on a peg underneath. He wore simple wool trousers and a heavy flannel shirt. He had a slight limp she hadn't noticed in the snow. He leaned his rifle against the wall, then moved to the fire. He took a log from a stack near the door and tossed it onto the grate. The thunk of the wood hitting the stone made Clara jump, a small, strangled cry escaping her lips. She pressed herself harder into the wall. Elias froze. He turned his head slowly and looked at her. He saw her, rigid with fear, her hands clenched at her chest. He saw the terror in her eyes. He didn't say anything. He just held her gaze for a second, then deliberately, slowly, turned back to the fire. He poked the logs, his movements measured. Careful. He did not make another sudden sound. Clara watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He knew. He had seen how she flinched. Amos had always loved to make her flinch. It had been his favorite game. But Elias just went back to his chores. He ladled something from the pot into a wooden bowl, added a hunk of dark bread, and walked toward her. Clara shrank, but there was nowhere to go. He stopped a good 6 feet away from her. He set the bowl on the floor. "Eat," he said. He walked away, turning his back on her again, and sat on the single stool, tending to the leather on one of his boots. Clara stared at the bowl. It was stew, venison. She could smell it. It was hot. Her stomach cramped with a hunger so violent it was painful. She waited for him to tell her she had to earn it, waited for the other shoe to drop. "It's not poisoned," he said, not looking up from his work. "Eat before it's cold." Her hand shaking, Clara slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor. She pulled the bowl toward her. She dipped her fingers in. It was hot, but not scalding. She brought them to her lips. The taste of the rich broth, the tender meat, the salt, it was so overwhelming she choked back a sob. She grabbed the bread and tore into it, stuffing it into her mouth, then using it to soak up the gravy. She ate like an animal, fast and desperate, not caring that she was spilling it, not caring about anything but the food. She finished the bowl in less than a minute, scraping the inside with her fingernail. She looked up. Elias was watching her. He had stopped working. His expression was impossible to read in the dim firelight. "There's more," he said, his voice quiet. Clara shook her head, suddenly ashamed. "No, that was... Thank you." He nodded once, then went back to his boot. The silence in the cabin settled, thick and heavy as wet wool. The only sound was the scrape of his knife on the leather and the rising shriek of the wind outside. The light in the small, grease paper window began to fade. The storm was here. It hit the cabin like a physical blow. The wind howled, a high, mournful sound that seemed to come from all directions. Snow began to lash against the door. The cabin walls groaned, but held. Clara pulled her knees to her chest, trying to make herself smaller. The world outside was disappearing. It was just this room, this fire, and this silent, broad-shouldered man. As darkness fell, the tension grew. Night was coming. There was one cot. Clara's fear, dulled by the food and warmth, returned with a sharp, cold edge. This was it. This was when he would collect his payment. But Elias just kept working. He mended his boot. He checked his traps. He oiled his rifle. The snick-snick of the cloth over the metal making her jump every time. He seemed to be ignoring her existence entirely. Finally, he stood. He stretched, his shoulders seeming to take up the entire cabin. He put his tools away, neatly. He looked at her, still huddled in the corner. "The floor by the hearth is warm," he said. He gestured to the flat stones. "You sleep there." Clara blinked. And you?" He pointed to the cot. "I'll take the bed." He grabbed a spare pelt, a heavy wolf fur, from the stack near her. He tossed it. It landed at her feet. "That'll keep the draft off." And with that, he went to the cot. He pulled off his boots, but nothing else. He lay down on top of the furs, his back to her, and pulled another hide over himself. Within minutes, the sound of his deep, even breathing filled the small space. He was asleep. Clara stared at his back, at the sheer size of him, just feet away. He was asleep. He had given her food, a warm place to sleep, and a heavy fur. And he had asked for nothing. He had not touched her. He had not even looked at her with that assessing, hungry look she knew so well. She was safe. She did not know what to do with the feeling. Trembling, she crawled over to the hearth. The stones were blessedly warm. She lay down on her side, facing the fire, and pulled the heavy wolf pelt over her. It was heavy and smelled of wood smoke and the wild. She lay awake for hours, listening to the storm rage outside and the steady breathing of the man in the cot. The firelight threw shadows that danced on the walls. She was trapped by the blizzard, trapped in a one-room cabin with a stranger. But for the first time in more years than she could count, she was not afraid of the man who was sleeping in the same room. The blizzard lasted 4 days. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin. Time blurred into a cycle of gray light at the window and the deep dark of the firelit nights. Elias spoke little. He was a man who seemed to hoard words. He moved around the cabin, tending his gear, sharpening his axe, carving a piece of wood. He ate. He slept. Clara tried to make herself invisible, but useful. She kept the fire fed when he was busy. She used his kettle to melt snow for water. She found a broom made of twigs and swept the floor, her movements small and quiet. On the second day, he dropped a heavy log by the fire. The sound was like a gunshot in the small space. Clara screamed. She didn't mean to. It was a thin, terrified sound. She dropped the pot she was cleaning and scrambled backward, her hands flying up to her head, bracing for a strike that didn't come. She was shaking, her eyes screwed shut. The cabin went utterly silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. "Clara." His voice was low. He had never used her name before. She hadn't even told it to him. She opened her eyes. He was standing over her. He hadn't moved. He was just watching her, his face grim. I thought," she stammered. "I saw, at the lean-to, a sack with my name." He nodded. He had found her meager belongings. "I'm not him." She didn't know what to say. She just stared at him, breathing hard. "I'm not him," he repeated, more firmly. He bent down, very slowly, and picked up the pot. He handed it to her. His hand was huge, scarred and calloused. It was steady. She took the pot, her fingers brushing his. His skin was warm. She pulled her hand back as if burned. He said nothing more. He went back to his side of the cabin, but after that, he moved with even more care. He placed the logs on the fire gently. He closed the door without letting it bang. On the third night, the storm was at its peak. The wind sounded like a woman screaming. Clara was huddled by the fire, trying to mend her own torn coat with a needle and thread she'd found in one of his tins. "You're running from your husband's brother," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara's hand stopped. She looked at him. He was sitting on his stool, carving. The knife moved in long, smooth strokes. She nodded. "Amos, my husband. He died, fell in a ravine, drunk. His brother, Silas, he said I was part of the property. He said the debts passed to him, and so did I." Elias's knife stopped. "And you ran." He tried to..." She couldn't say it. "I hit him with a skillet, and I ran. I just ran." She looked down at her hands. "I've been running ever since." Elias nodded, as if this made all the sense in the world. He resumed carving. "Most men are animals, given the chance." The silence stretched, but it felt different now, less empty. Clara found her voice, though it was small. "What about you?" He stiffened. The knife paused again. "What about me?" "You're running, too." He looked at her, his eyes dark in the firelight. He gave a short, harsh breath that might have been a laugh. "I suppose I am." "From what?" He set the piece of wood down. He stared into the fire, his face hardening, the shadows carving deep lines into it. "From the war," he said, his voice a low gravel. "From the things I did, from the things I saw, from the world that came after." He looked at his own hands. "Some men are animals. I was one of the worst. I'm just done." He was running from everything. She was running from one man. She looked at this big, quiet man, this man who could kill with his bare hands, who had been gentle with her. He was as broken as she was, just in a different place. "My name is Elias," he said, still looking at the fire. "Clara," she whispered back, though he already knew. The storm howled. Inside the cabin, two broken people sat in the warm silence, the unspoken truth of their pain hanging in the air between them, more real than the wind, more solid than the stone of the hearth. When the blizzard broke, the world was a blinding, suffocating white. The snow was piled high against the door, and it took Elias the better part of an hour to shovel a path to the woodpile. Clara watched him from the cabin, feeling small and useless. The silence that followed the storm was almost as loud as the wind had been. In the close quarters of the cabin, every movement, every breath, seemed to echo. Clara knew she had to earn her keep, or the fragile truce they had built would shatter. She was eating his food, taking up his warmth. The terror of her near starvation had faded, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. She started small. She kept the fire fed, a task she understood. She melted snow for water. She took the tin of rough ground coffee she'd found and, after he grunted his approval, learned to make it just the way he liked it, boiled thick and black, strong enough to strip paint. Her hands, she noticed, were almost always shaking. Not from cold. Not anymore. It was the hunger that had settled deep into her muscles, a persistent tremor that made her clumsy. One morning, while Elias was outside checking a snare line, she found his mending kit. It was a simple soldier's kit in a small tin, a few sturdy needles, coarse thread, a lump of beeswax, his flannel shirt. The one he wore daily had a long tear near the cuff. She sat on the floor by the fire, the heavy shirt in her lap. The fabric was rough, worn thin, and smelled of him. Pine smoke, iron, and sweat. Her fingers fumbled with the needle. She was a poor seamstress. Amos had always told her so, usually after ripping a button from his shirt in a rage. But she worked at it, her stitches small and uneven. When Elias returned, stamping snow from his boots, he saw her. He stopped by the door, his eyes fixed on the shirt in her lap. Clara flinched, expecting him to be angry that she had touched his things. I was just fixing the tear, she said, holding it up, her voice small. He stared at the clumsy, tight line of stitches. He walked over, not speaking. He took the shirt from her hands. He looked at the mend, then at her fingers, which were red and pricked from the needle. He said nothing. He just put the shirt on the stool and went to the pot of stew she had simmering over the fire. The next day, she decided to help with the wood. He kept a smaller pile of split logs inside, but it was running low. She put on her thin, ruined coat, wrapped her feet in scraps of burlap she'd found, and went outside. The cold hit her face like a slap. The axe was leaning against the wall, its head buried in a large stump. She pulled it free, surprised by its weight. She set a piece of unsplit pine on the stump and lifted the axe. She brought it down, but her arms were weak. The blade bit into the wood at an angle and stuck. She tried to pull it free, but it was lodged tight. She pulled again, her breath clouding, her hands trembling from the effort. She heard the crunch of his boots behind her. "Give me that!" He didn't sound angry, just impatient. He put his gloved hand over hers on the axe handle. His grip was firm, warm even through her glove. He easily worked the axe free. "You'll lose a finger," he said flatly. "Go inside. Keep the fire." "I have to help," she insisted, her voice tight with shame. "I have to earn the food." Elias stopped. He turned to look at her fully. The winter sun was bright on the snow, and it lit his face. His beard was thick, but she could see the hard line of his jaw. "You're earning it by not dying," he said. He gestured at her thin coat. "You're not built for this. Go in." He turned back to the stump, swung the axe, and split the log in one clean, powerful motion. Clara stood there, feeling useless, watching him work. As he reached for another log, the sleeve of his own coat rode up. She saw his forearm, thick with muscle, and then she saw hers. As her own tattered cuff fell back, her wrist was a map of old miseries, faded yellow and purple bruises, the ghost of fingerprints. Higher up, on her bicep, was a newer one, darker, from where Silas had grabbed her. She yanked her sleeve down, but it was too late. He had seen. Elias stopped mid-swing, the axe resting on his shoulder. His eyes flickered from her arm to her face. He didn't ask, he didn't say a word, but she saw something move in his jaw, a tight clenching of muscle. He looked for a second, more dangerous than he ever had. Then he turned away from her and attacked the wood. He split log after log, the thwack of the steel sharp and violent in the cold air. He didn't speak again until the pile was high. "Take this inside," he said, gesturing to the armload of split wood. His voice was rough. "And stay there." That night, the cold in the cabin felt deeper. The hearth was warm, but the stone floor leached the heat from her bones. She slept poorly, curled on the wolf pelt, waking every hour to shiver. The next afternoon, Elias started working in the corner opposite his cot. He brought in several long, smooth poles of aspen he'd had curing outside. He started sawing and measuring. Clara watched him, her anxiety returning. He was building something, a trap, a cage. Her mind, trained by years of fear, supplied terrible answers. He worked for hours, the scrape of the saw and the tap of his hammer the only sounds. When he was done, he dragged the new object near the fire, into the warmest part of the cabin. It was a bed frame, simple but sturdy, a raised platform of wood, laced with rope to hold a mattress. It was rough, but it would keep her off the cold stone. He went to his own cot and grabbed the thickest, warmest buffalo hide. He threw it onto the new frame, smoothing it out. Clara stared. What is that?" "It's a bed," he growled, as if it were obvious. "The floor's too cold. You'll get sick. I don't need a sick woman on my hands." He grabbed the thin wolf pelt from her spot by the hearth and tossed it onto his own cot. "You take this," he said, pointing to the new bed. It's warmer. Clara looked at the bed, then at him. He had spent his afternoon building this for her. He had given her his best hide. She didn't understand. Kindness without a price was something she had never known. It scared her more than his anger. "Why?" she whispered. Elias looked uncomfortable. He shrugged his massive shoulders and turned away to stir the fire. "Practical. Can't have you catching lung fever." She moved to the new bed, her movements hesitant. She touched the thick fur. It was softer than anything she had felt in years. That night, she slept for 6 hours straight and woke feeling almost human. Weeks passed. The snow piled deeper. The world was just the cabin. Clara grew stronger. The stew, the regular warmth, the absence of fear, it was mending her. The shaking in her hands lessened. But she was filthy. Her hair was matted, her skin sticky with the grime of her journey. She washed her face and hands in a basin of melted snow each morning. But it wasn't enough. She dreamed of hot water. One morning, Elias pulled on his heavy buffalo coat. "Going to check the far lines," he said, his voice clipped. "Up on the ridge. I'll be gone till sundown. Maybe after." He looked at the fire, then at the large kettle he used for boiling meat. "Keep the fire hot. There's plenty of water melted." Their eyes met. He knew. He was giving her the cabin. He was giving her privacy. The moment the door shut, Clara's heart hammered. She was alone. She dragged the heavy wooden bar into place, locking the door. She stood with her back to it, breathing, alone, and locked in. It felt impossibly safe. She worked quickly, dragging the wooden tub from the corner, filling it with bucket after bucket of snow, which she melted in the kettle. It took over an hour to get enough water, and more time to heat it. Finally, the tub was half full of steaming, blessedly hot water. She peeled off her clothes, the layers of rags she had worn for months. She looked down at her body, at the bruises, the thinness. She was ashamed. She stepped into the water and sank down. The heat was a shock, so wonderful it made her dizzy. She had a small piece of lye soap she'd found in his supplies. She scrubbed her skin until it was red. She washed her hair, working the tangles out with her fingers, the dirt coming off in gray clouds. She sat in the tub until the water grew cool, just weeping silently. She was washing away more than dirt. She was washing away Amos. She was washing away Silas. She was washing away the road. When she was done, she dried herself with a clean scrap of linen. She felt new, raw. Her skin was tender. She put on the mended flannel shirt of Elias that she had claimed for sleeping. It was huge on her, hanging to her knees, but it was clean. She was just finishing braiding her damp hair when she heard the heavy crunch of his snowshoes. She panicked, her heart leaping into her throat. She looked at the door, still barred. He was outside. She was safe. She heard him stop at the door. He didn't knock. He didn't rattle the latch. He just waited. Her hands shaking, she ran to the door and lifted the heavy bar. She stepped back as the door swung open. Elias stood there, framed against the blue evening light. Snow clung to his beard. He carried 2 rabbits, limp and dark. He looked at her. He saw her clean, pale skin. He saw her damp, braided hair. He saw her standing in his own shirt. His eyes lingered for only a second. But in that second, she saw something new. A heat, a stillness. It wasn't the cold assessment of Silas or the brutish hunger of Amos. It was something else, something quiet and heavy. He broke the gaze first. He stepped inside, dropping the rabbits by the door. "Smells like soap," he rumbled. He didn't look at her again. That night, the tension in the cabin was different. It was sharp. Clara felt naked. Though she was fully dressed, she was aware of his body, of the way he moved, of the space between them. When it was time to sleep, she went to her new bed. "No," he said, his back to her. Clara froze. "What?" He turned. He looked at the cot, then at her. "Take the cot. It's got a proper mattress. Straw tick. It's softer." "That's your bed," she said, her voice trembling. "And I'm telling you to take it," he said. His voice was low, but firm. "This new one, the ropes will stretch. It's not right. Take the cot." He was giving her his bed, his own bed. She didn't argue. She couldn't. She walked to the cot and sat on the edge. It was, as he said, softer. He took the new, rougher bed by the fire. He lay down, his back to her, and pulled the wolf pelt over him. The silence grew comfortable in the following weeks. They developed a rhythm. He would hunt or chop wood. She would cook, mend, and keep the cabin. They spoke, but not often. Theirs was a language of gestures. The way he left the best piece of meat in the pot for her. The way she made sure his gloves were always dry and warm by the fire when he came in. One evening, he sat carving, and she was patching one of his socks. "Spring will be here in a month," he said, his voice quiet. "Maybe 6 weeks. The pass to the south will open first. The horse is strong. He'll get you to Colorado." Clara's needle stopped. She stared at the sock. He was reminding her. She had to leave. That was the bargain. "No strings," he added, his voice rough. "You stay till the thaw. You take the horse. You're free to go." She heard the words, but she also heard the thing beneath them. A tremor, a slight hesitation on the word go. She looked up at him. He was staring at the wood in his hands, his knuckles white. She just nodded. "Thank you, Elias." A few days later, he came in from checking his traps, shaking the snow from his coat. He walked over to her, where she sat by the fire. He held out his closed, gloved fist. "For your hair," he said. He opened his hand. Lying on the rough leather was a hair comb. It was carved from a piece of light-colored aspen. It was simple, the tines straight and even. But the top was carved with a small, simple flower. He had sanded it and polished it with tallow until it was perfectly smooth. Clara stared at it. A gift, a real gift. Something he had made, something beautiful. She remembered the last thing Amos had given her, a tin bracelet he'd won in a card game, which he'd thrown at her head. She reached out a shaking hand and took the comb. It was still warm from his grasp. She ran her thumb over the smooth wood, over the petals of the flower. A tear slid down her cheek, then another. She turned her head away, furious at herself, trying to hide it. She wiped her face with her sleeve. It's just the smoke." Elias stood there for a long moment. "Aye," he said, his voice impossibly soft. "The smoke's bad tonight." He turned and went back to his side of the cabin, pretending not to see her weep silently into her hands, clutching the comb. The nights were the hardest. The cabin was too small. The silence too full. One night, a bitter cold snap drove the temperature down so far the logs of the cabin popped and groaned. Elias got up and unhooked a jug from a high shelf. Whiskey. He poured a finger into his tin cup. He looked at Clara, huddled on the cot. "You want some? It cuts the cold." She nodded. He poured a small amount into her own cup. She took a sip. The liquid fire burned all the way down. But it was good. It was warm. He sat on his stool, not on his bed, closer to the fire. He stared into the flames, nursing his cup. He was quiet for a long time. "I killed a boy once," he said. The words dropped into the cabin like stones. Clara stopped breathing. "In the war," he continued, his voice a low rumble. "He couldn't have been more than 15, maybe 16, from Tennessee." He took a drink. "We were clearing a farmhouse, near Shiloh. They said the house was full of sharpshooters. We were told to clear it. No prisoners." His hand tightened on his cup. "I kicked the door in. He was there, in the kitchen. Not a sharpshooter, just a boy in a uniform that was too big. Holding a rifle he didn't know how to fire. He was crying for his ma." Elias closed his eyes. "I had my orders. He looked at me, and He didn't finish. He didn't have to." "I've been hiding from that boy's face for 10 years. He whispered. "I built this cabin to get away from him, but he's here every night." He looked at her, his eyes hollow. "That's what I am. Clara, that's the man you're sharing a roof with." The confession hung in the air. A terrible, dark truth. Clara looked at this man, this killer, this gentle giant who had built her a bed and carved her a comb. And his pain, so raw and old, unlocked her own. "I had a child," she whispered. Elias's head snapped up. He stared at her. "A boy," she said, her voice thick. "He was born 2 winters ago. He was small, but he was perfect." She looked at the fire, seeing another time. "It was a hard winter, like this one. Amos, my husband, he was gone, trapping. The food ran low. I did my best. I kept him warm, but he got a cough in his lungs." She was shaking. He got so quiet, and one morning I woke up and he was cold. He was just so cold. The tears were streaming down her face now, but she didn't wipe them. "Amos came home 2 days later. He found me. I was still holding him. He said it was my fault. He said I was too weak, that I didn't love him enough to keep him alive." She choked on a sob. "And then he... She couldn't say it. She just covered her face and broke. The sobs tore out of her. Huge, ragged, animal sounds of grief she had held inside for 2 years. She hunched over on the cot, her body convulsing. All the pain, all the fear, all the loss, it was all coming out. She felt the cot dip. She heard him move. Elias was standing in front of her. He looked terrified. He was a man who understood rifles and traps. Not this, not a woman breaking apart. He reached out a hand, then pulled it back. He didn't know what to do. Clara, in her grief, didn't even think. She just needed an anchor. She lunged forward and collapsed against him, burying her face in the rough flannel of his shirt, clutching his waist. Elias went rigid, his entire body tensed, his arms stiff at his sides. He was a wall of muscle, unmoving. She clung to him, weeping into his chest. "He blamed me," she sobbed. "He blamed me." He stood there, a stone wall, letting her grief wash over him. He smelled of wood smoke and the cold outdoors. He was solid. He was real. Slowly, awkwardly, his arms came up. He didn't pat her. He didn't stroke her. He just held her. His huge hands rested on her back, one on her shaking shoulders, one on the small of her back. He just held her. He held her while the storm howled outside. He held her while she cried out all the poison and the pain. He held her until her sobs quieted into shudders, and the shudders into trembling. She was exhausted, empty. She was still pressed against him, her ear to his chest. She could hear his heart. It was beating hard and fast. He was still holding her, as if he was afraid to let go. She leaned her head back to look at him. His face was inches from hers. His eyes were dark, full of a pain that matched her own. He looked at her mouth, then at her eyes. He lowered his head, slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. He pressed his lips to her forehead. It was not a lover's kiss. It was not a kiss of passion. It was hesitant. It was rough, his beard scratching her skin. It was a kiss that tasted of whiskey and salt. It was a promise, a benediction. It cracked something open inside her. She let out a small, broken sound and clutched his shirt tighter, her knuckles white. "Elias," she whispered, her voice raw. I'm afraid. I'm so afraid to be touched." He didn't move. He just rested his forehead against hers. His eyes closed. His breath was warm on her face. "I know," he rumbled, his voice thick. But she did not pull away. She stayed there, in his arms, in the warm, dim light of the cabin. And for the first time in her life, she felt the opposite of afraid. That night, the kiss on her forehead had undone something in Clara. The confession of her lost child, and his confession of the boy he'd killed, had bound them in a way that food and shelter never could. They were two damaged things, huddled together against the cold, and that shared understanding was a different kind of warmth. Spring was still a promise, not a fact. February held the mountains in a grip of iron. The snows were deep, the cold so bitter it burned the lungs, but inside the cabin, a new rhythm had taken root. It was no longer just his cabin, it was theirs. She no longer waited to be told what to do. She rose before him, adding logs to the banked coals, coaxing the fire back to life. She learned the small sounds of the cabin, the groan of the roof under new snow, the pop of the kettle just before it boiled, the scrape of his knife on wood. She mended his clothes, her stitches growing straighter and more confident. The shaking in her hands had mostly stopped, a tremor only returning when she was tired or startled. She cooked, making stews that were thick and nourishing, and she learned to bake a rough, dense bread in the Dutch oven, burying it in the coals. He, in turn, worked with a restless energy. He chopped wood every day, the pile outside growing into a fortress wall. He spent 2 days on the roof after a heavy snow, shoveling the drift and replacing shingles of bark that had come loose. He was a silent partner in their domestic world, but a present one. He would come in, stamp the snow from his boots, and hang a fresh rabbit on the hook, and she would simply nod and take it down to skin. The space between them, once a chasm of fear and silence, had shrunk. It was now filled with a different kind of tension. It was a wire, pulled taut. Their eyes lingered. She would look up from her mending and find him watching her, his gaze steady and unreadable from across the room. He would be carving, his big hands moving with surprising delicacy, and he would pause, his eyes fixed on the way the firelight caught the red in her hair. Their hands brushed, once. She handed him a mug of hot coffee, and his fingers grazed her own. It was a jolt, sharp and hot as the liquid itself. She pulled her hand back, her breath catching. He said nothing, but his knuckles were white on the mug's handle. She found herself sitting closer to the fire, her stool now only a few feet from his. The cabin was small, but this was a choice. She felt safer in his proximity. The solid, quiet bulk of him was a comfort. One morning, she woke to a strange sound, a rhythmic scraping. Elias was standing near the water basin, his back to her. He had a small, cracked piece of mirror propped against the wall. He had heated water, and a cloud of steam rose around his head. He was shaving. He had lathered his face with a brush and a harsh-smelling soap, with his long hunting knife, held steady as a surgeon's tool. He was scraping away the thick, frosted beard. Clara sat up on the cot, pulling the hide up to her chin, and watched. With every pass of the blade, a new man was uncovered. The wild mountain man disappeared. She saw the strong, square line of his jaw. She saw the full, surprisingly soft shape of his mouth. She saw a long, pale scar that ran from the corner of his eye down to his chin, a white line against his winter-pale skin. He looked younger. He looked harder, in some ways, and he looked terribly sad. He turned to rinse the blade in the basin and saw her watching. Her eyes were wide, her mouth partly open. She did not look away, not this time. She just stared, taking in the stranger who had been living with her all this time. He held her gaze. He didn't smile. He just watched her look at him. Finally, a flush crept up her neck, hot and heavy, and she dropped her eyes to her hands. The beard, she stammered, feeling foolish. It was itchy. Aye, he rumbled. He turned back to the mirror, his hand not quite as steady as before. It was. That night, the silence was different again. It was heavy, charged. She was acutely aware of his face, of his mouth. He looked at her more, his eyes no longer veiled by the wild hair. They ate their stew in silence. The fire crackled. The wind was low. Clara put her empty bowl down. Her heart was beating so fast she thought it might break from her chest. She had been thinking about it all day, about his hands, how they could be so strong on an axe but so careful when he carved, about his gentleness. "Elias?" Her voice was barely a whisper. He looked up, his new face strange and beautiful in the firelight. She had to force the words out. Have you ever—" She stopped, her courage failing. She took a breath and tried again. "Have you ever touched a woman gently?" He went utterly still. The spoon in his hand stopped halfway to his mouth. He did not look at her. He lowered the spoon, very slowly, back into his bowl. He stared into the fire. The silence stretched, long and thin. She was afraid he was angry, that she had crossed a line. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she almost missed it. "Only in dreams. Clara." He looked up, and his eyes were full of a raw, lonely truth that matched her own. Only in dreams. Her heart ached for him. For both of them. He was as unmarked by kindness as she was. He was as new to this as she was. A week later, the sky turned a flat, dead gray. The wind picked up, and within an hour, the world was gone, erased by a blinding wall of snow. It was a new blizzard, fiercer than the first. For 3 days, they were trapped. The cabin, which had become a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The walls pressed in. The air was thick, heavy with unspoken things. They could not escape each other. He sat mending a trap on his side of the room. She sat on her cot, patching a hole in his trousers. He was restless. He would get up, pace the 2 steps to the door, look out the small, snow-clogged window, and sit back down. On the second day, he was working on the trap and snagged his shirt, tearing a gash in the sleeve and smearing it with bear grease. He grunted in annoyance. "This is ruined." He stood up and pulled the heavy flannel shirt over his head. Clara froze. He was standing in the middle of the room, naked from the waist up. He turned his back to her as he looked for a new shirt. She saw the broad expanse of his back, the play of muscles under his skin as he reached for a peg. And she saw the scars, not just the scar on his face. His back was a map of old violence, a puckered, round scar on his shoulder, a bullet, long, thin white lines that looked like they'd been laid on with a whip. It was a history of pain. She couldn't look away. She drank in the sight of him, the strength, the damage. He turned, holding a clean shirt, and he caught her. He saw her eyes, wide and fixed on his skin. He saw the flush on her cheeks. He saw the small parting of her lips. She blushed, a deep, painful scarlet, and ducked her head, staring at the mending in her lap. "I'm sorry, I wasn't—" He did not put the new shirt on. He just stood there, in the middle of the room, bare-chested. He was letting her look. He was letting her see him. "Clara," he said, his voice quiet. She forced herself to look up. "There's nothing to be sorry for," he said. He slowly, deliberately, pulled the clean shirt on, but he did not button it. That night, the storm raged. It felt like the wind was trying to tear the cabin from the hillside. The tension was a living thing. Clara felt it in her skin, a prickling heat. She could not eat. She could not sit still. Elias watched her. He had not taken his eyes off her since the incident with the shirt. After their small, untouched meal, Clara stood. She was trembling. She could not live in this space between, not anymore, not in this small, storm-tossed room. She walked over to him. He was sitting on his stool, staring into the fire. He looked up as she approached, his eyes dark. He stood, towering over her. She had to tilt her head back to look at him. She was terrified, but the fear of this was less than the fear of her old life, and less than the fear of this aching loneliness. "Elias," she whispered, her voice shaking. I don't know how to want it, without feeling afraid." His whole body tensed. She saw his hands clench and unclench at his sides. She saw his throat work as he swallowed. He lifted his hands. They were shaking. He raised them slowly, giving her time to back away. He cupped her face. His hands were huge, rough, calloused from the axe, but his touch was light as a moth's wing. He held her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "Then we don't go fast," he whispered. He leaned down. He did not kiss her forehead. He kissed her mouth. It was hesitant. His lips were chapped, rough, but warm. It was a question. She gave a small, broken sound, and her eyes fluttered closed. She kissed him back. It was clumsy and desperate and achingly real. He deepened the kiss, and it was like falling. She gripped the front of his unbuttoned shirt, her knuckles white. He pulled her closer, one hand sliding from her face to her back, holding her steady. He pulled back, his breath ragged. He looked into her eyes. "Clara!" She was trembling. A tear slipped from the corner of her eye. A memory, dark and violent, flashed in her mind. Amos's hand, his weight. She stiffened. "I can't." He let go of her instantly. He stepped back. "All right." "No," she said, the word torn from her. "Please." She was crying now. "I want to. I'm so afraid." He looked at her, his heart breaking. He understood. He took her hand. He didn't pull her. He just held it. "Come here," he said, his voice thick. He led her to the cot, his cot. He sat her down on the edge. He knelt in front of her, so he was looking up at her. He was still holding her hand. "It's just me," he said. "It's just Elias. And we don't do anything you don't want. We stop when you want. All right?" She nodded, tears rolling down her face. He lifted his hand and, with one finger, brushed a tear from her cheek. Then, slowly, he began to unbraid her hair. His big, clumsy fingers worked at the plaits, gentle, patient. He undid the braid, his fingers combing through the long, soft strands. He leaned in and kissed her again, slow and deep. He kissed her until her trembling eased, until she was leaning into him. He unbuttoned her dress, his hands shaking badly. Each button was a struggle. She helped him, her own fingers fumbling. The dress pooled at her waist. He eased it over her shoulders. She shivered in her thin chemise. He stood and pulled back the hides on the cot. "Get in! Get warm!" She slid under the heavy furs. He took off his own boots, his shirt. He was down to his trousers. He blew out the main lamp, leaving only the dim, flickering light of the fire. He lay down on the cot beside her, on top of the furs. He didn't touch her. He just lay there, a solid, warm presence next to her. "Are you all right?" he whispered. She turned to him. Yes. He touched her arm, his fingers trailing from her shoulder to her wrist. "You're safe, Clara." She moved toward him, a small, hesitant motion. It was all the invitation he needed. He gathered her against him. He kissed her face, her eyes, her neck. His touch was reverent. It was aching. When she flinched, a memory of a rough hand, he stopped, instantly. He pulled his head back. "What is it?" "Nothing," she whispered, ashamed. "Just a shadow." "It's not him," Elias said, his voice fierce. He held her face between his hands. "It's me. Look at me, Clara." She opened her eyes. She saw his face, the scar, the desperate tenderness in his eyes. "It's just me," he said again. He was slow. He was hesitant. He learned her body with his hands, and he let her learn his. It was fumbling and awkward, and more beautiful than anything she had ever known. When he finally came inside her, it was with a gentleness that broke her heart. She trembled, and tears streamed down her face. But they were not tears of pain. They were tears of release. After, she lay curled against him, and the dam of her shame broke. She wept. She wept for how long it had been. She wept for the shame of Amos, who had made this act a thing of violence. And she wept because, God help her, she had wanted this. She had wanted him. "I'm sorry," she sobbed into his chest. I'm not, I shouldn't." Elias held her. He said nothing until her sobs quieted. He pulled the thickest buffalo hide from the floor, the one he had slept on, and wrapped it around her, cocooning her. He held her tight, his chin resting on the top of her head. "You're not wrong to feel, Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You're not wrong to want. Don't ever be ashamed of it, not with me." He held her, and for the first time in her life, she fell asleep in a man's arms and felt completely safe. From that night, everything was different. The wire between them had snapped, replaced by a thick rope. There was no more question of where they slept. That night, Elias moved his few belongings from the floor, and he slept in the cot with her. They lay tangled together, his body a furnace against her back. The cot was narrow, forcing a closeness that was new and comforting. Her nightmares did not stop. If anything, the new intimacy brought them closer to the surface. She woke one night, her own scream lodged in her throat, her hands fighting something that wasn't there. "No, get off me, please, Amos, no!" Instantly, he was awake. He gripped her wrists, not hard, but firm. "Clara, wake up, it's me, it's Elias." She blinked in the dark, her chest heaving, the terror of the dream clinging to her. "Elias?" "I'm here," he said, his voice calm and steady in the dark. He pulled her against him, holding her head to his chest. "You're here. You're safe. It was just a dream. He's not here." He stroked her hair, his hand big and warm. He whispered to her, not apologies, but simple truths. "You're in the cabin. The snow is deep. The fire is low. I'm right here. You are safe." He held her like that until her breathing evened out, until the rigid terror left her limbs. He held her until she fell back asleep. The days grew a little longer. The sun felt a little warmer. There was a sense of peace in the cabin, a fragile domesticity that felt real. Until the day Elias went out to check his trap lines and was gone for hours. He came back just as the sun was dipping behind the ridge, casting the valley in purple shadow. He didn't stamp the snow from his boots. He just came inside and stood by the door, his face a hard mask. "What is it?" Clara asked, a cold knot of dread forming in her stomach. "Elias, what's wrong?" "Tracks," he said, his voice flat and hard. "Down by the creek. 3 riders. Shod horses, not wild." Maybe trappers?" she suggested, but her voice was weak. He shook his head. "No, they were circling, making a big loop of the valley, looking for something, or someone." He looked at her, his eyes dark. "They're new tracks, from this morning." Clara's blood went cold. She knew, with a certainty that stopped her breath, who it was. Silas. He had waited for the worst of the winter to break, and now he was coming for his property. She walked over to Elias, her newfound strength feeling like ash. She grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into the thick wool of his coat. "He found me," she whispered. "Oh God, Elias, he found me." The dread that had settled in the cabin was cold and heavy, a physical weight. The tracks in the snow had changed everything. The silence that Elias and Clara had filled with hesitant intimacy and shared warmth was gone, replaced by the silence of a held breath. Elias was up before the first gray light touched the snow. He moved with a purpose Clara had not seen before. This was not the man who carved combs or gently held her through nightmares. This was the man who had survived Shiloh. He checked his long rifle, his movements economical and precise. He cleaned the barrel, checked the action. He laid out his ammunition, a small leather pouch of cartridges, a powder horn. "I'm going to scout the ridge," he said. His voice was flat, all the warmth gone. "Bar the door behind me. Don't open it until you hear me knock. 3 short, 1 long. Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She was back in that place of cold fear, her stomach a knot of ice.
"Elias,"
she whispered as he reached for the door. He paused, his back to her. "Be careful." He didn't answer. He just slipped out into the pre-dawn gloom, his snowshoes making almost no sound, and disappeared into the timber. Clara rushed to the door and slid the heavy wooden bar into place. The thud of the bar felt final. She was locked in, but this time, it did not feel safe. It felt like being in a trap. She spent the day waiting. The hours dragged, stretching into an eternity. She could not eat. She could not sit still. She paced the small floor, from the cot to the hearth, from the hearth to the door. She would stop, listen, hear nothing but the wind in the pines, and pace again. She thought of the horse, tethered in the small lean-to. Her first instinct was to run, to take the horse and ride south until the snow or the men claimed her. It was all she knew how to do. But she thought of Elias, out there, tracking men who were hunting her, and she stayed. The sun was high and beginning its descent when she heard it. 3 sharp taps on the door, a pause, 1 long, solid knock. Her hands fumbled with the bar, her relief so profound she almost wept. She dragged it open. Elias stepped inside, bringing a gust of cold air with him. He was covered in snow, his face grim. He barred the door himself. "It's them," he said. He didn't need to elaborate. "You saw them?" "I saw their camp." He pulled off his heavy gloves, his movements angry. "They're maybe 2 miles east, down in the draw. 3 of them. They're not trappers. They're hired men. They have good horses, good rifles, and they're not moving on. They're resting their mounts, and they're watching the smoke from this chimney." He knew, and now she knew. They were waiting. They were planning. "They'll come tomorrow," he said. "At dawn. That's how men like this work. They'll come when it's light enough to shoot, but cold enough to catch a man sleeping." Clara sank onto the stool by the fire, her legs giving way. "They worked for Amos, my husband." Elias looked at her, his eyes dark. "You said you ran from his brother, Silas." "I did." She stared at her hands, at the healed cracks and new calluses. She owed him the rest of it. He was preparing to fight for her, and he didn't even know the whole truth. When Amos died, his debts were large. Silas took the land, the cabin, everything, and he said I was part of it. He said I was chattel, just like the livestock. Her voice was dull, recounting a horror she had lived with for months. He wasn't just going to keep me. Elias, he was in debt too, badly. He made a bargain with a man from Cheyenne who runs a saloon. Elias went still. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. Clara forced herself to say the last, most shameful part. He was going to sell me to him, to work in the saloon for $200. The silence in the cabin was absolute. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. Elias did not move for a full minute. He stared at the wall, at the long rifle hanging on its pegs. His face was a mask of stone. Clara had seen him angry, had seen him sad. She had never seen him like this. This was a cold, pure rage that was terrifying in its stillness. $200, he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He turned to her. You hit him with a skillet. And I ran, she whispered. I've been running ever since. I thought I could make it to Colorado, to my aunt. I didn't know the winter would come so fast. Elias looked at her gaunt face, at the fear in her eyes, the fear she had lived with her whole life, the fear of being property, of being used, of being sold. He nodded once, a sharp, sudden movement. All right. He walked to the wall and took down the rifle. He began, again, to meticulously check his ammunition. What are you doing? She asked. though she knew. "I'm getting ready," he said. "For what?" He finally looked at her, his eyes flat and hard as iron. "Then we fight." The word sent a new, sharper terror through her. "Fight! Elias, no! You saw them! There are 3 of them! They're killers!" "I've met killers before," he said, his voice clipped. "No." She jumped to her feet. "No, I won't let you. This isn't your fight. It's me they want. I'll go." She moved toward the door, her old instinct screaming, "Flight! Survival!" "Go where?" he demanded, his voice stopping her. "Away. I'll take the horse. I'll ride south. I'll lead them away from here. You'll be safe." He let out a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. "You think they'll just let you go? You think they'll get you and ride off? They'll take you, and they'll kill me for being in their way. Or they'll kill me first and then take you. That's how this ends." "Then I'll go now," she cried, her voice breaking. "Before they come. I'll go while it's dark. Please, Elias, I can't be the reason you... You can't be the reason I what?" He stepped in front of her, blocking her path to the door. "Die? I've been dying up here for 10 years. Clara, a little bit every day. Hiding from the man I was. This is the first time in a decade I've had a reason to be something else." "I'm not a reason," she shouted, and the force of her own voice shocked her. She was weeping now, hot, angry tears. "I'm a burden. I'm trouble. I'm the woman who gets men killed. Amos died because of his own recklessness. And Silas wants to sell me like a mule. I am not something to be fought over." She slammed her fist against his chest, a weak, desperate blow. "Don't you dare try to be my savior. I don't need another man trying to own me, even if he's gentle. I won't have your death on my hands." The accusation hung in the air. Savior. Elias grabbed her arms. He didn't shake her. He just held her, his grip like iron, forcing her to be still. His face was inches from hers, his eyes burning into her. "You listen to me," he said, his voice low and fierce. "I am not Amos. I am not Silas. I am not saving you." He paused, his jaw working, fighting for the right words. Words did not come easy to him. "You're not property, Clara," he said, his voice raw. "Do you hear me? You are not a thing to be bought or sold or claimed. You're not a burden." He took a ragged breath. I'm not saving you. I'm choosing you. There is a difference." His words struck her dumb. "I'm choosing you." It was not the voice of a savior. It was not the voice of an owner. It was the voice of a man making a stand. The anger and fear drained out of her, leaving her weak and trembling in his grasp. He was choosing to stand between her and the world. She looked at his face, at the scar, at the pain in his eyes. He was just as broken as she was, and he was choosing to fight. "They'll kill you," she whispered, the last of her resistance. "They'll try," he said. He let go of her arms, his hands gentler now, coming up to cup her face. "But this is my home. This is my land. And you are with me. I will not let them take you." The fight had broken the last barrier between them. The external threat, the shared confession, the violent argument. It had all led to this. Clara stared at him, at this man who was willing to put his body between her and her past. She surged forward and kissed him. It was not like their first time, hesitant and healing. This was fierce. It was desperate. It was a claiming. She kissed him with all the fear and rage and desperate, aching need she had. She kissed him like she was trying to pour all of her broken strength into him and draw all of his into her. His response was immediate. He backed her against the solid wood of the cabin wall, his mouth devouring hers. His hands were in her hair, gripping her, holding her to him as if he could absorb her into himself, keep her safe inside his own skin. It was a storm. The blizzard outside had been nothing compared to this. This was elemental. It was a fight against the cold, against the men coming at dawn, against the entire world that said they had no right to this. He lifted her, his arms like steel bands, and carried her the few steps to the cot. He didn't lay her down gently. He fell with her, a tangle of limbs and desperate breath. Their lovemaking was not slow. It was not tender. It was a raw, breathless, desperate coupling. It was a confirmation of life in the face of death. It was the only answer they had to the men in the woods. It was a pledge, made not with words, but with teeth and hands and bodies. It was the sound of two people clinging to each other at the end of the world. After, they lay tangled in the furs, their breath slowing, their bodies slick with sweat despite the cold. The cabin was dark, the fire burned low, the silence had returned. But it was different again. It was the heavy, sated silence of a decision made. Clara lay with her head on his chest, her ear over his heart. It was beating, strong and steady. Against her cheek, she was safe. For this night. She thought of the spring. She thought of the horse and the bargain. She thought of the pass to Colorado. It all seemed like a story from another life.
Elias?
She whispered into the darkness. He grunted, his hand stroking her hair.
I don't want to leave in the spring.
His hand stilled. He was quiet for a long moment. Then his arm tightened around her, pulling her so close she could barely breathe. He kissed the top of her head.
You don't have to,
he said, his voice thick. They fell asleep like that, a defiant knot of two souls in the vast, cold dark. The light came too soon. It was a bare, gray suggestion of morning, not yet dawn, but it was enough. Clara woke to the lack of warmth. Elias was gone from the cot. She sat up, her heart leaping into her throat. He was standing by the door, fully dressed, his rifle in his hand. He was staring at the small, greasy paper window, listening. She started to whisper. He held up a hand, silencing her. And then she heard it, a sound that did not belong, the crunch of boots on frozen snow, the snort of a horse, quickly muffled. They're here, Elias said, his voice flat. Clara threw the furs off. She scrambled from the cot, her fear a cold shock of adrenaline. Her dress was on the floor. She pulled it on, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fasten the buttons. Stay away from the window, Elias commanded, his voice low. Get against the back wall, by the hearth. No, she said. He turned to look at her, his eyes sharp. No, she repeated, her voice shaking but firm. I will not hide. I will not cower. She looked around the room, frantic. Her eyes landed on the table, on the long, sharp skinning knife he used for the rabbits. She grabbed it. The handle was smooth. Worn wood. It fit her hand. Elias watched her. A flicker of something, pride, maybe, passed over his face. He nodded once. Beside me, then, not in front. He moved to the door. He didn't open it. He stood just to the side, his rifle ready. Hello, the cabin, a voice called from outside. It was rough, laced with a false heartiness. Elias said nothing. We know you're in there, the voice yelled. We saw the smoke. We're looking for a woman. Name of Clara. Clara Pike. She belongs to Silas Pike, over in Sweetwater. Clara flinched at the name. Pike. The name she had tried to bury in the snow. Send her out, the man yelled, and we'll have no trouble with you, mountain man. Elias stayed silent, his breathing low and even. He was waiting. There was a muttered conversation outside. Then, footsteps, closer. The latch on the door rattled. Whoever it was found it barred. Open this door, damn you, a new voice snarled. Elias raised his rifle, pointing it at the thick wood of the door. Clara's heart was a drum. Her knuckles were white on the knife. Last chance, the first voice called. We're coming in. Elias shifted his stance. He was a rock, a mountain. He was not moving. Through the small window, Clara saw them, 3 dark figures against the graying snow. They were spreading out. One was carrying an axe. They were going to take the door. Elias looked at her. His eyes were calm. He was not the haunted man from Shiloh. He was not the lonely hermit. He was just a man, protecting his home. He glanced at the door, then back at her.
Stay ready,
he whispered. He put his shoulder to the wall, bracing himself. Clara took a breath. Her hand was shaking, but she held the knife tight. She stood beside him, ready. The sound of boots on snow, the muffled snort of a horse. They were here. "Hello, the cabin." The voice was a harsh bark, trying to sound friendly and failing. Clara pressed her back against the log wall, her knife held low, her knuckles white. Elias was a statue of dark wool and iron, his rifle held ready, his body just clear of the door. "We know you're in there," the voice continued. "Saw the smoke. We're looking for a woman, name of Clara, Clara Pike. She belongs to Silas Pike, over in Sweetwater." Clara's old name hit her like a slap. Pike, a name she thought she'd buried. "Send her out," the man yelled, "and we'll have no trouble with you, mountain man." Elias remained silent. He was listening. He was counting. He was a predator in his own den. Clara could hear them muttering outside. One voice was angry, impatient. The other was the leader. "He ain't answering, boss."
I see that, you fool.
Footsteps crunched closer. The door latch rattled. A sharp, metallic sound that made Clara jump. "Open this door, damn you," the new voice snarled. Elias just breathed, slow and deep. "A last chance," the leader called out. "We're coming in. You can have the woman, or you can have a fire. Your choice." Clara's eyes widened in terror.
Fire? They would burn them out.
She looked at Elias. He didn't flinch. His face was granite. He leaned his head toward the door, his voice not a shout, but a low, carrying rumble that vibrated through the wood.
"She's not property."
There was a stunned silence from outside. "What'd he say?" "He said she ain't property," the leader yelled, his voice laced with disbelief and fury. "Who the hell do you think you are, mountain man? She's owed. Silas Pike is owed for what her worthless husband lost. She's the payment." "She's not payment," Elias said, his voice even colder. "She's a free woman. You're on my land. Ride out." "Free?" The man laughed, a short, ugly bark. "That's rich. We're not leaving without her. We'll smoke you out like rats. We'll burn this cabin to the ground with you both in it." Elias glanced at Clara. His eyes were clear. He was not afraid. He was decided. He turned his face back toward the door and spoke his final words on the matter. "You want her," he said, his voice dropping so low it was almost a whisper. Yet it cut through the air. "You'll have to kill me first." That was the end of the talk. "You heard him, boys!" the leader roared. "He wants to die. Get the door." A heavy, metallic thunk rang out as an axe bit into the thick wood. Clara cried out. The door shuddered. Elias didn't wait for a second blow. He raised his long rifle, braced it against his shoulder, and aimed at the place on the door where a man's chest would be, just to the right of the latch. He fired. The explosion in the cabin was deafening. It filled the small space with smoke and a sound so loud it felt like a physical blow. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. A high, strangled scream came from outside. A man's voice, cut short. "God, I'm hit!" "He shot him! He shot him through the door!" "Get back!" the leader roared. "Get to cover! Light him up!" Gunfire erupted. The small, greasy paper window exploded inward, spraying shards of ice and paper into the room. Bullets tore through the opening, thudding into the back wall, high over Clara's head. "Down!" Elias roared. He grabbed Clara and shoved her hard, pushing her to the floor behind the meager protection of the cot. She landed hard on the stone, the skinning knife clattering but still in her grip. Elias moved, not toward the back, but toward the wall with the broken window. He kept low, a shadow in the sulfur-choked smoke. "He's at the window!" a man yelled. Elias rose up, his rifle at his hip, and fired again into the gray light. He didn't aim. He just sent a wall of lead and smoke out into the world. He was answered by 2 shots. One whined past his head and buried itself in the roof beam. The other did not. Elias grunted, a sharp, pained sound. He staggered back, his left shoulder jerking as if kicked. He slammed into the wall and stayed standing, his teeth bared.
Elias!
Clara screamed. He raised the rifle again, but he was slower. He was hurt. Clara rose to her knees. She saw him, his left arm hanging useless, his hand pressed to his shoulder, blood already seeping between his fingers. He was trying to work the lever on the rifle with one hand, his face a mask of pained fury. She looked past him, through the ruined window. She saw movement.
By the woodpile. One of the men. He was reloading, fumbling with cartridges, his own rifle leaning against the stacked logs. He was maybe 30 feet away.
He hadn't seen her. He was watching Elias. Rage, cold and pure, unlike anything she had ever felt, washed over Clara. It burned away the terror. It burned away the years of cowering. On the table, where Elias had left it that morning, was his pistol, a heavy Colt, dark and deadly. She didn't think. She scrambled across the floor, grabbed the gun. It was heavy, so heavy, and got to her feet. She ran to the window, to Elias's side. She raised the pistol with both hands, her arms shaking so badly she could barely aim. The man at the woodpile looked up. His eyes went wide. He grabbed for his own rifle. Clara pulled the trigger. The gun jumped in her hands, the sound flat and sharp. She missed. The bullet kicked up snow at his feet. He raised his rifle. She pulled the trigger again, screaming as she did, a raw, wordless sound of fury. This time, she did not miss. The man cried out, a high, thin sound. He didn't fall. He just grabbed his leg, high on the thigh, and collapsed onto the woodpile, his rifle clattering into the snow. He writhed, cursing, blood dark against the white snow. Clara stared, her hands still locked on the gun, smoke curling from the barrel. "The third one!" Elias gasped, shoving her with his good shoulder. "Where's the third one?" They both looked. The leader, the man who had done the talking. He was gone. There was a sound of panicked scrambling, the crack of a branch, and then the frantic, desperate pounding of a horse's hooves, galloping away, fading into the trees. He had fled. Silence fell. It was heavier than the gunfire. It was absolute. The only sounds were the man by the woodpile, sobbing and cursing, and the drip, drip, drip of Elias's blood onto the stone floor. "He's gone," Elias panted. He slid down the wall, the long rifle clattering from his grip. He left a long, dark, red smear on the logs. Clara turned. She was still holding the pistol. She looked at it, as if she had never seen it before. She let it drop to the floor.
Elias,
she breathed. He was sitting on the floor, his head back against the wall, his eyes closed. His face was a pale, waxy gray. His entire left shoulder was soaked. Blood ran down his arm, over his hand.
"He's bleeding out,"
she whispered, her voice numb. The man outside was still screaming, "Help me! For God's sake, I'm bleeding! Don't leave me!" Elias opened his eyes. He looked at Clara.
"The door,"
he rasped.
"Bar it."
Clara ran to the door. The axe was still lodged in it. The man Elias had shot through the wood was lying in a heap, a few feet back, unmoving, dead. She slammed the bar back into place. She ran back to Elias. He was slumped over, his head on his chest. "No," she said. "No, you don't." She grabbed him under his good arm. "Help me, Elias, help me!" He groaned, but he pushed with his legs. She half dragged, half lifted him to the cot, his boots scraping the floor. He collapsed onto it, his head lolling.
"Clara,"
he murmured, his voice thick.
"I'm here." She was frantic. "I'm right here. Don't you go. Don't you dare."
She looked at the wound. It was high on his shoulder, near the collarbone. A dark, ugly hole. It was bleeding. It was bleeding too much. She ran to the shelves. Whiskey. The mending tin. She grabbed a clean rag. She had to cut his shirt off. Her hands were shaking again. But this was different. This was not fear. This was adrenaline. She used the skinning knife, slicing through the heavy, blood-soaked flannel. She exposed the wound. It was torn, and it was deep. She didn't know if the bullet was still in there.
"This is going to hurt,"
she whispered, her voice breaking. She uncorked the whiskey jug with her teeth. She took a breath and poured it directly into the wound. Elias screamed. His whole body arched off the cot, a raw, animal sound of agony. He grabbed her arm with his good hand, his grip so tight she thought her bones would break.
"I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm sorry. I have to.
He fell back, panting, his eyes squeezed shut. She threaded the needle from the mending tin. Her hands were slick with his blood. She held the needle over the lamp's flame until the tip glowed red. She poured more whiskey on the rag and wiped the wound clean, her stomach heaving. And then she began to sew. She stitched his skin back together, her own tears blurring her vision. It was ugly, clumsy work. She was mending him like he was a torn shirt. He groaned with every pass of the needle, his body twitching.
"Hold still,"
she wept.
"Please, Elias, hold still."
She finished the last stitch and tied it off. She was covered in his blood. She bandaged him with strips of clean linen, binding the wound tight. He was pale, so pale. His breathing was shallow. His skin was cold, clammy, even by the fire. She covered him with every hide in the cabin. She stoked the fire until it was roaring, a furnace. The man outside had finally gone quiet. Elias's eyes flickered open. He looked at her, his gaze unfocused.
"Clara," he whispered.
"I'm here," she said, taking his good hand. It was cold. "You shot," he murmured. "Yes, I shot him." A faint smile touched his lips.
"Good."
His eyes rolled back. He passed out. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. Clara did not sleep. She did not rest. She became a creature of pure, animal will. The cabin, which had been his sanctuary, became her fortress. On the first day, his fever set in. He burned. He thrashed in the cot, lost in a world of gunfire and blood. He called out names she didn't know. He spoke of Shiloh. He cried out for the boy he had killed. Clara did not leave his side. She bathed him in snowmelt, trying to cool his skin. She forced water between his cracked lips. She held him down when he tried to tear at his bandages. And through it all, when the delirium was at its worst, he would call for her. "Clara, where? Clara!" "I'm here," she would say, her voice raw, gripping his hand. "I'm right here. Elias, I'm not leaving." The second day, she had to face the world outside. She was running low on wood for the fire. She unbarred the door, Elias's pistol tucked into the waistband of her dress. The cold hit her. The world was still. The man she had shot in the leg was gone. He had crawled away, leaving a long, dark trail in the snow that disappeared into the trees. She hoped he would die. The dead man, the one Elias had shot through the door, was still there. He was frozen, his eyes open, staring at the gray sky. Clara felt nothing. No pity, no fear, just a cold, hard resolve. She dragged the body by its boots. It was heavy, stiff. She dragged it away from the door, away from the wood pile. She left it in the snow by the trees. She would deal with it later. She gathered wood, her back to the corpse, her eyes constantly scanning the timberline. She felt, for the first time in her life, completely, terrifyingly alive. She returned to the cabin, barred the door, and went back to tending her patient. She skinned the rabbits he had caught before the fight. She made a thin, hot broth. When Elias was lucid for a brief moment, she lifted his head and made him drink. "You have to," she commanded, her voice firm. "You will not die. I will not allow it." He looked at her, his eyes clouded with fever, but he drank. She tended the fire. She mended the window with a piece of stretched hide. She cleaned the rifle and reloaded the pistol. She paced the floor, listening. The cabin was hers now. She was its master. She was defending her home. She was defending her man. On the fourth day, the fever broke. She woke from a half-sleep, slumped in the stool by the cot, to find him watching her. His eyes were clear. The terrible heat was gone from his skin. "Clara," he whispered. His voice was a dry rasp. She sobbed, a single sharp sound of relief. "You're back." "You stayed," he said. "I stayed," she said, gripping his hand. He looked around the cabin. He saw the mended window. He saw the rifle, clean, leaning by the door. He saw the pot of broth simmering on the fire. He saw her face, gaunt and smeared with soot. But her eyes were different. The fear was gone. He tried to sit up and groaned, falling back. "No," she said, "not yet. You've been shot." "You did this?" he asked, his hand weakly touching the thick bandage on his shoulder. "I did." He looked at her, and a slow, painful smile touched his lips. "Good work." As he recovered, the power in the cabin shifted. He was weak, and she was strong. She fed him. She helped him. She gave the orders. "You need to walk," she told him a few days later. "I'm tired," he grumbled. "I don't care. You'll get cot sore. Get up." He got up. He leaned on her, and they paced the small room. He was a giant, leaning on her small frame, but she did not waver. He sat by the fire, watching her. She was mending his torn shirt, her stitches neat and small. "Clara," he said. She didn't look up, her hands busy with the needle. "What?" They might come back. Silas." She pulled the thread tight, her knuckles white. She looked up, her gaze level, her eyes hard as winter stone. "Let him come," she said, her voice clear and cold. "I'm not his property. I'm not a mule to be sold. I'm not anyone's to take." She looked at Elias, and her gaze softened. Just a fraction, but it held a new kind of power. Not anymore. Elias just stared at her. This was not the terrified woman he had found trying to steal his horse. This was someone new. This was the woman who had faced down killers and sewn a man back together. A week later, the world changed. A warm wind blew from the south. The snow, which had seemed eternal, began to retreat. The sound of dripping water was everywhere. The roof cleared. The creek, which had been a ribbon of ice, began to flow. Spring, it had finally come. The dead man by the trees was revealed. "We have to," Elias said. His arm was in a sling, his face still pale, but he was on his feet. They took the shovel. They walked deep into the woods, to a place where the ground had thawed. They dug a shallow grave in the soft, wet earth. They buried him. They didn't say any words. They just filled the hole. They stood there for a moment, in the warming air. The first birds of spring were singing in the bare branches. It was over. "He's gone," Clara said. "The one I shot, he's not coming back. And the other, he's never going to stop running." "No," Elias agreed. "He won't." They stood in the quiet of the woods. The pass to the south would be clear in a week. The bargain was coming due. Clara turned to him. "Elias." You came up here to live alone, to get away from the world." He looked at her face, which was thinner, harder, but more beautiful than any he had ever seen. "I did."
Do you still want that? She asked, her voice quiet. Do you still want to be alone?
He looked at the trees, at the melting snow, at the new grave. He thought of the empty, silent years. He thought of the boy from Shiloh. He thought of the last few days, of her voice in his fever, of her hand in his. He turned back to her. He reached out with his good hand and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Not if you're not with me, Clara. Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not let them fall. She just nodded once. The next morning, she packed. It didn't take long. They had his traps, his rifle, his axe, her comb, the mending tin. She went to the lean-to, the bay horse, which had survived the gunfire. Snorted. Glad to see her. She saddled him. She led him to the cabin. Elias came out, his arm still in the sling, the rifle strapped to his back. Clara put her foot in the stirrup and swung herself up onto the saddle. She looked down at him. "This cabin," he said, his voice rough. It's all I have." "No, it's not," she said. "It's a box of bad memories. It's where you came to hide. We're done hiding." She held her hand down to him. He looked at her hand, then at her face. He took it. "Pull me up," she said. He put his boot in the stirrup and, with a grunt of pain, swung up behind her, settling on the horse's rump. He put his good arm around her waist, holding her tight. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice in her ear. "You told me once about a meadow, up high, between two ridges, with a stream." "Aye," he said, a note of surprise in his voice. "I did." "Let's go there," she said, taking the reins. "Let's find a better place to build something new." She clicked her tongue, and the horse, carrying the two of them, walked out of the clearing, away from the cabin, and toward the high country, into the spring. They rode for 3 days. The journey was slow. Elias was weak, his arm bound tightly in the sling. He rode behind her, his good arm wrapped around her waist, his body slumped against her back. It was the first time she had ever felt his weight as a burden, and the first time she had felt strong enough to carry it. She was his strength now. She handled the horse. She made the camp. She scouted the trail. He would sit, his back against a stone, his face pale and tight with pain, and watch her. He watched her skin a rabbit with the knife she had used to defend him. He watched her build a fire with a flint and steel. He watched her, and the look in his eyes was something she had never seen before, a quiet, profound respect. Spring was exploding around them. The thaw was violent. The creeks were swollen, brown and roaring. The snow was retreating up the mountainsides, leaving behind a world of wet, black earth and the sharp, green smell of pine. The air was soft. On the 3rd day, Elias shifted behind her. "Here," he said, his voice a low rasp near her ear. "Turn up this draw. Follow the water." She guided the horse off the main trail, into a narrow canyon. The path was steep, hidden by thick stands of aspen and willow, their branches just beginning to show the first pale, tender buds. They rode upward for an hour, the sound of the stream their only guide. Then the canyon walls fell away. Clara pulled the horse to a stop. It was exactly as he had promised. A meadow, perhaps a mile long, half a mile wide, nestled between two towering granite ridge lines. It was a hidden world. A fast, clear stream cut through the middle, its banks lined with green grass. The soil looked dark and rich. It was untouched. It was protected. There were no tracks. There were no neighbors for miles. "Elias," she whispered, her voice full of awe. "I found it years ago," he said, his voice thick. He was exhausted. "I thought maybe someday." "We're home," she said. She slid from the horse. She turned and held up her arms. He let himself slide down, leaning on her, his legs unsteady. "We're home," she said again, and she helped him to the bank of the stream, where he sat. And finally, let the tension of the last month go. He watched the water, and she, for the first time, did not scan the trees for threats. She just breathed in the clean, safe air. The summer was a time of hard, healing work. They began by building a simple lean-to, a temporary shelter from the spring rains. Elias's shoulder healed slowly. It was stiff, and he would never again have the full strength of it. But he was a man made of iron. He taught her to fell the lodgepole pines. He would cut the deep wedge, his good arm and his stiff arm working together, his face tight with the effort. Then she would take the axe, learning to strike the same spot, over and over, until the great crack echoed through the meadow and the tree fell. She would strip the branches, her hands, which had once trembled, now sure and strong. They worked from sunup to sundown. They were building their life, one log at a time. As they worked, Clara took the lead. She had a piece of charcoal, and on a scraped, cured deer hide, she drew the plan. "The hearth will be here," she said, pointing. "Stone, wide enough to cook and to heat." Elias nodded. "Aye, like the old one." "No," she said, her voice firm. She looked up at him, her face smudged with dirt. "Not like the old one. The old one was a hole to hide in. This one is a home to live in." She drew a square on the hide. "Here," she said, "a window, a big one, to let in the morning light." Elias looked at the mark. A window that big was a luxury. It was a weakness in a fight. It was a place for heat to escape. "And here," she added, drawing another, smaller square on the west wall. "Another one, for the afternoon. I am tired of the dark. Elias, I want to see the sun." He looked at her, at the fierce certainty in her eyes. This was not the woman he had found in the snow. This was his partner. He had hidden from the light for 10 years. She was bringing him out of the shadows. "Aye," he said, his voice soft. "2 windows." They built it log by log. It was slow. He notched the logs, his body aching. She helped him lift them, her muscles straining. They chinked the walls with mud and moss, their hands working side by side. When it came time for the beds, Elias started to build 2 narrow frames, his mind stuck in the habit of their old, separate lives. Clara put her hand on his. "No," she said. He stopped, confused. "Build one," she said, her voice low. "Just one, but build it wide and strong." He held her gaze. He understood. He put the wood for the second frame aside. He built one bed in the warmest corner, and they laced it with strong hide, wide enough for 2 people to lie without touching, and wide enough for them to hold each other through the night. But the wood for the second frame still lay in the corner. A week later, while Clara was outside, Elias built it, a simple, narrow cot. He did not know why, habit, or fear. A part of him still felt he did not deserve the comfort of her. When she came in, she saw it. She looked at him, and he looked away, ashamed. For when the baby comes," he mumbled, "you'll need space." She walked over and touched the raw wood. She said nothing. They put it against the far wall. It became a place to stack the mending, a place for his traps. It was a bed they never used, a quiet reminder of a loneliness they had outgrown. By the first chill of autumn, the cabin was finished. It was solid. It was bright. And it was theirs. Life settled into a new rhythm. The healed scars, both theirs, defined the new shape of their days. Elias's shoulder was stiff in the mornings. He could no longer draw his bow, and his aim with the rifle was not what it had been. "You have to learn," he told her one crisp October morning. He held out the long rifle. "I'm not as fast as I was. You need to be." She took the heavy gun. She was not afraid of it anymore. He taught her to stand, to breathe, to squeeze the trigger, not pull it. Don't just use your eyes, use your body. Feel where the bullet will go. She practiced. The kick of the butt against her shoulder was a hard, solid truth. She learned to hit the pine cone he set on a log at 50 yards. "Now the pistol," he said. He taught her to shoot with both hands, to reload quickly. "You saved my life, Clara, but you were lucky. We can't live on luck." "No," she agreed. "We can't." While he taught her his skills, she taught him hers. As the nights grew long and cold, she brought out the scraps of fabric she had saved, pieces of her old dress, scraps of his old shirts, a piece of clean canvas. "I'm making a quilt," she said, "to cover the bed." He would sit by the fire, his hands idle, watching her tiny, neat stitches. His own hands, scarred and powerful, felt useless in the evenings. "Here," she said one night, holding out the needle and a square of blue flannel. "You can help." I can't," he said, looking at the tiny needle. "My hands, they're too big. I'll break it." "They're strong," she said, "but they're not gentle. You can learn." She put the needle in his hand. She guided his fingers. He was clumsy. His stitches were huge and uneven. He cursed under his breath, frustrated. "You can fell a tree in a blizzard," she said, her voice soft, a hint of laughter in it. "You can face down 3 gunmen. I think you can sew a straight line. Elias." He grunted, but he kept at it, night after night. He would sit, tongue between his teeth, and slowly, painstakingly, push the needle through the cloth. He was learning her quiet strength, just as she had learned his. Once a month, they would ride to town. It was a full day's journey to the east, a small, rough settlement called 3 Forks. They needed salt, flour, coffee, and cartridges. The first time they rode in, the town went silent. The men on the boardwalk stopped, watching them. They saw a giant of a man, scarred, with one arm held stiffly, and a woman who sat her horse as well as any man. She was thin, but her eyes were not. Her eyes were old and steady. As she dismounted at the general store, Elias was at her side. He watched the men who watched her. His hand never went to his gun. It just rested on his hip. But the message was clear. He was a wall. He was a warning. Inside, men looked at Clara. They saw her face, the way the light caught her hair. They saw the faded bruises and the new, hard strength. One miner, reeking of whiskey, tipped his hat. "Afternoon, ma'am. A fine day." His eyes lingered. Elias said nothing. He simply stepped between them. His shadow fell over the miner. Elias was a mountain, and he just looked at the man. The miner stammered an apology and moved away, his drink forgotten. Clara, busy with her list, hadn't even noticed. She was checking the price of flour. She looked up at Elias. "Did we need shot for the traps?" He looked down at her, the cold iron in his eyes melting. "No," he said, his voice soft. "Just for her. We're fine." She only had eyes for him. They were a world of 2, moving through the noise of others, and they were untouchable. But the scars were deep. The past was not a dead thing. It was just a sleeping one. One evening, Clara was stirring the stew, her back to him. He came up behind her, his boots silent on the floor. He put his hand on her back, just between her shoulder blades, a simple, absent gesture of affection. She screamed. She dropped the spoon, spinning around, her hands flying up to cover her face. She was not in the new cabin. She was in the old one. She was in Silas's grasp. She was bracing for the blow from Amos. "No, please!" Elias recoiled, his hand snatched back as if he'd touched a hot stove. "Clara!" She was shaking, her eyes wide and unseeing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Clara," he said, his voice gentle, terrified. "It's me. It's Elias." He did not touch her. He just held out his good hand, palm up. "You're here. You're in the meadow. You're safe. It's just me." Her eyes slowly focused on his face.
She saw the scar. She saw the pain in his eyes. This was not Amos. "Elias," she whispered, the terror fading, leaving shame in its place. She collapsed against the wall. "I'm sorry. I thought—" "I know," he said. He knelt in front of her. "It's all right. It was just a shadow." He kept his hand out until she, her own hand trembling, placed it in his. He held it. He just held it until the shaking stopped. He had his own shadows. The war, the boy. He woke one night with a guttural roar. Sitting bolt upright in the wide bed, he was fighting. He was grappling with a ghost, his arms flailing. "The charge! Get, God, the boy!" Clara, who would have once cowered, did not flinch. She lit the lamp, the yellow light flooding their corner. She grabbed his stiff shoulder. "Elias," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through his terror. "Wake up! You're here! You're home!" He blinked, his eyes wild and unfocused. He was sweating, his body rigid. "You're in the meadow," she said, her voice softer now. "It's just me. It's Clara. You're safe. The war is over." He looked at her. Recognition dawned, slow and painful. He let out a ragged breath and pulled her to him, burying his face in her hair, his shoulders shaking. "It's never over," he whispered. I can see his face." "I know," she said, holding him tight. "But you're not alone in it anymore. Tell me what you saw." And he did. In the middle of the night, in the light of the lamp, they told each other everything. They spoke their nightmares aloud, and the spoken fear, they found, began to lose its power. One night, late in the summer, a thunderstorm rolled down from the high peaks. It was a violent, echoing storm. The cabin lit up with flashes of lightning, and the thunder cracked so loud it shook the logs. Clara was restless. She stood at the new window, watching the rain lash the meadow. The storm reminded her of the blizzard, of the night she had told him her fears, of the night she had wanted, but been too afraid. Elias sat on his stool, watching her. He knew where her mind had gone. She turned from the window. The cabin was lit by the fire and the flashes of lightning. She looked at him. Her heart was beating, not with fear, but with something else, a slow, heavy pulse. She walked to him. She did not hesitate. She stood before him, and slowly, she began to unbutton her dress. Elias's breath hitched. "Clara?" She let the dress fall from her shoulders, pooling at her feet. She stood before him in her thin chemise. She was not the gaunt, starved creature he had found. She was thin, yes, but she was strong. She was beautiful. She climbed into his lap, straddling his legs, wrapping her arms around his neck. This was her choice, her action. "I want to," she whispered, her voice fierce, her forehead pressed against his. "I want to want it. Not because I'm scared, not because we're hiding, not because I'm trading. I want you." She pulled back, her eyes looking into his. "I want to feel it, without him, without the shadows." She took a shaky breath. "Show me again, Elias, show me how it's supposed to be." He looked at her, at this woman of impossible strength. He saw her, bearing not just her body, but her soul. He kissed her. It was not the hesitant, healing kiss of their first time. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of the night before the fight. It was slow. It was deep. It was reverence. He lifted her, her legs still wrapped around him, and carried her to the wide bed. He laid her down on the quilt they had made together. He took his time. He was not a soldier. He was not a hermit. He was a worshiper. He healed her with his hands, and with his mouth. He unraveled every old knot of fear, every shadow of Amos, and replaced it with a new, bright memory. He touched her with a reverence that made her weep, but this time, the tears were not for pain. When she cried out, the sound was lost in the crack of thunder, and it was a cry of pure,
unadulterated release. Autumn deepened. The aspen trees in the meadow turned a brilliant, burning gold. They worked, preparing for the winter. They had a store of smoked meat, dried roots, and flour from town. Clara had been quiet for a week. A private, secret smile touched her lips. She was tired, more than usual. One night, they sat by the fire. The quilt was finished, a patchwork of their old lives, now covering them both. She was mending one of his socks. She stopped, the needle poised. She set the mending aside. She took his hand. It was scarred, calloused, the fingers clumsy. She lifted it. She placed it on her stomach, flat against the wool of her dress. Elias went still. He looked at her, his eyes wide, questioning. He felt the slight, new roundness there. Clara nodded. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but she was smiling. I'm with child. Elias. His breath left him in a shudder. He remembered her story. The child she had lost. The man who had blamed her. He slid from his stool and knelt on the floor in front of her. He was a giant, kneeling before her. He pressed his hand harder against her, as if he could protect what was inside. He leaned his head forward and rested his scarred forehead on her stomach. He was shaking. "We won't lose this one. Clara," he whispered, his voice thick, a promise that was half a prayer. "Not this time." The snow came, just as it always did, but this year it was not a threat. It was a blanket. It fell outside the two bright windows, piling in soft white drifts. But inside, the cabin was full of light. It was full of warmth. And for the first time, it was full of laughter. It was full of the smell of bread baking in the hearth. They were safe. That night, the world was quiet. The snow fell, and the meadow was silent. They lay in the wide bed, wrapped in the quilt, his arm a solid weight around her. Clara lay awake, listening to his steady breathing. She was full of a peace so profound it felt like a dream. "Elias?" she whispered in the dark. He grunted, half asleep. She smiled, her face pressed against his chest. "I stole your horse once." She felt him shift. He pulled her closer, his hold tightening. He kissed her forehead, then her hair, breathing her in. "You stole more than that," he replied, his voice a low, happy rumble. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment and let us know. Be sure to subscribe to From Wild West for more stories like this, and share your thoughts with us in English. We appreciate every one of you.